there is something happening right now, in the exact moment before sleep takes you, that has been happening to every human being who has ever lived. Your breathing is slowing, the weight of your body is settling, the thoughts that felt urgent an hour ago are softening at their edges, losing their sharpness, becoming something closer to images than words. And somewhere in the older, deeper parts of your brain, a system that is far more ancient than language or fire or the first human city, is quietly doing what it has done every single night for hundreds of thousands of years. It is checking the darkness. It is listening for movement. It is doing, in this moment, exactly what it was doing when your ancestors lay down on the floor of a cave in Africa 200,000 years ago and closed their eyes against the African night, hoping that the fire they had built was still burning, hoping that whatever was moving, the darkness beyond its light, was moving away rather than toward them. Tonight's story is about that darkness. It is about what the night was before electricity made it a thing we could ignore, before candles made it a thing we could push back, before fire made it a thing we could survive. It is about what our ancestors did when the sun went down and the world they could see became a world they could only hear. It is about how they slept, what they dreamed, what they feared, what they did in the long hours between first dark and dawn. And it is about something remarkable that scientists have only recently begun to understand, that the way you sleep tonight, the specific shape and rhythm and biology of your rest, was not designed for the world you live in. It was designed for the African night, for the savanna and the firelit cave, for a darkness so complete that it changed everything about what it meant to be human. Before any of that, before the fire and the cave and the darkness, there is a more basic question that almost nobody thinks to ask. What was the night like before human beings could control it at all? Not the night as we experience it today, softened by streetlights and phone screens and the orange glow of cities visible from orbit. The real night, the night that existed before electricity, before gas lamps, before candles, before the first deliberate fire was struck and fed and kept alive through the cold, dark hours. To understand what your ancestors experienced every time the sun went down, you have to try to imagine a darkness that most people living today have never actually seen. In the modern world, genuine darkness is almost impossible to find. Light pollution has spread so comprehensively across the industrialized parts of the earth that as many as 80% of people living in North America and Europe cannot see the Milky Way from where they live. The night sky that your great-grandparents considered ordinary, a blazing river of stars arcing from horizon to horizon, dense enough in places to cast a faint shadow, is now visible to most people only when they travel somewhere remote. Astronomers have a term for what most people today consider a dark sky. They call it Bortle, Class 4 or 5, which means it is not actually dark at all. A genuinely dark sky, a Bortle Class 1, is something so different from what most people have ever experienced that observers who see it for the first time often describe feeling disoriented, almost frightened, by the sheer density of light above them. The sky seems too bright, too full, wrong, in a way they cannot immediately place. Because we have all calibrated our sense of what the night sky looks like against a version of it that has been systematically dimmed by the light we produce ourselves. Now take away even those stars, close the sky with cloud, extinguish every fire, remove every candle and every lamp and every phone screen and every distant glow of a city over the horizon. What remains is the darkness that human beings lived inside for the vast majority of their existence on this planet. Not a comfortable, navigable darkness. A darkness so complete that you genuinely cannot see your hand in front of your face. A darkness in which the only information available to you comes from your ears, from the feeling of air on your skin, from the smell of the world around you, and from whatever the fire you were desperately hoping was still burning might tell you about the circle of safety it could create against the dark. Human beings are not creatures of the night. This is not a metaphor or a cultural observation. It is a biological fact, and one that shaped everything about how our ancestors experienced the hours between sunset and dawn. Our eyes are engineered for daylight. The cones that give us color vision and sharp detail require significant light to function at all. In darkness, we shift to our rods, the light-sensitive cells that work in low-light conditions, but that give us only a desaturated, low-resolution tunnel vision view of the world, slow to adapt, poor at tracking fast movement, almost useless for reading the subtle visual cues that tell you whether a shape in the shadows is a tree or a predator. Most of the large predators that shared the African savanna with our ancestors were far better equipped for the night than we were. Lions, leopards, and hyenas all have visual systems adapted for low-light hunting. They have a reflective layer behind their retinas called the tapetum lucidum that essentially doubles their light-gathering capacity, giving them eyes that glow in the dark when a light source catches them. In the African night, on an open savanna with no fire and no shelter, when a lion could see you far better than you could see it. This asymmetry in night vision was not a minor inconvenience. It was an existential threat that shaped the evolution of human behavior in ways that scientists are only beginning to fully trace. A 2011 study published in the journal PLOS One looked specifically at lion attacks on human beings in rural Tanzania, cross-referencing the attacks with lunar cycle data to see whether the amount of moonlight available on a given night predicted the likelihood of an attack. The results were striking. Lion attacks on humans were significantly more common in the hours after dark, on nights with little or no moonlight than on nights near the full moon, when ambient light was higher. The pattern held most strongly in the period between sunset and 10 at night on dark nights, exactly the window when lions were active and hungry after the daylight rest period. The researchers concluded that lions had effectively learned to exploit the period of maximum human visual vulnerability, the dark of the moon after sunset, as their most productive hunting window. This is not ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant. It is ancient history in the sense of having been real, persistent, and significant enough over hundreds of thousands of years to leave marks on human neurology that are still detectable today. The fear of the dark that children across all cultures display at roughly the same developmental window, around 4 to 6 years of age, is one of those marks. Psychologist Martin Seligman gave this pattern a name in 1971, calling it prepared learning. The idea that human beings are biologically predisposed to acquire certain fears far more readily than others, because those fears were adaptive in the ancestral environment. Darkness, heights, snakes, spiders, sudden loud noises, these are fears that take hold quickly, often from a single experience, and that resist extinction through reason in a way that learned fears do not. You cannot, as researchers have dryly noted, think your way out of a million-year-old survival circuit. Children who have grown up in environments with no particular cultural mythology around the danger of darkness, children who have never seen a nature documentary about lions, still show the same fear at the same developmental stage, across cultures with remarkable consistency. The wiring predates the culture, and then, somewhere around 400,000 years ago, possibly earlier, everything changed. The moment is not precisely dated. The archaeological evidence for early fire use is fragmentary and contested, and the difference between evidence of fire use and evidence of deliberate, controlled fire-making is one that archaeologists have argued about for decades. But the broad consensus places the reliable, widespread control of fire in the range of 300,000 to 400,000 years ago, with possible earlier instances going back much further. And when fire came, when the first deliberately maintained flame pushed back the African night, around a cluster of human beings sitting in the dark, the world was divided into two for the first time in a new way. There was the lit circle, and the unlit world beyond it. There was the inside and the outside. There was safe and dangerous, illuminated and dark, known and unknown, and human beings have been living at that boundary ever since. The campfire did not just provide light, it provided heat, which extended the range of environments where humans could survive. It provided the ability to cook food, which dramatically increased the caloric value of what our ancestors could eat, and may have been a significant driver of the evolutionary expansion of the human brain. It provided protection against predators, whose fear of fire kept them outside the circle of tanned, in a way that allowed sleeping humans to rest more safely than they could have in the open bare darkness. But it did something else too, something less immediately practical and more profoundly human, something that anthropologists who study the role of fire in social evolution have come to believe may be its single most important contribution to what eventually became human culture. It gave people something to sit around in the dark. The distinction between what human beings do in the daylight hours and what they do after dark, around a fire, is one that researchers have studied in contemporary hunter-gatherer communities that still maintain traditional fire-centered nighttime practices. A study of the Juhonsi-San people of southern Africa, one of the most extensively studied hunter-gatherer communities in the world, found that daytime conversations centered almost entirely on practical matters: food, resources, logistics, who was going where and why, tool maintenance and repair, the social navigation of resource allocation. But after dark, when the fire was lit and the work of the day was done and the community gathered around the flame against the night, the conversation changed. Stories emerged, accounts of the spiritual world, of ancestors, of animals with the ability to speak or transform, of the meaning of events that had no obvious practical explanation. Music appeared, dance appeared, the integration of the living community with the dead, with the cosmic, with the aspects of experience that daylight practicality had no room for. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner published a landmark study in 2014 analyzing recordings of Juhonsi conversations across different times of day and found that while only 6% of daytime talk involved stories, around 80% of firelit nighttime conversation consisted of stories. That is not a subtle difference. It is the difference between a practical, resource-managing primate and a myth-making, meaning-creating, culturally transmitting human being. The fire did not just push back the darkness, it created a protected social space inside the darkness, a place where the full range of human expression could emerge without the immediate pressure of survival tasks. And in that space, something that looks very much like the beginnings of human culture took root and grew. Think for a moment about what those firelit nights would have felt like. The fire itself is a presence. It moves. It makes sounds, crackling and settling, and occasionally sending a shower of sparks up into the dark above. The faces of the people around it are lit from below, which gives them an unfamiliar quality, shadows falling upward rather than down, expressions harder to read than in daylight. The darkness beyond the fire is absolute, and in it, the night sounds continue. Insects, wind, the occasional distant call of an animal, the closer sounds that might be something approaching and might be nothing at all. The fire holds the group together. To move away from it, even to relieve yourself at the edge of the camp, is to step from the lit world into the dark world, and the body registers that transition with a jolt of alertness that no amount of intellectual reassurance entirely suppresses. This is where human storytelling was born, not in a comfortable room with adequate lighting and the general sense that everything was probably fine, in a circle of warmth and light against an active darkness, with predators real enough to have killed members of the group in living memory, with a night sky above so full of stars that it was impossible not to feel small beneath it, and with hours to fill before the dawn made it safe to move again. The stories that emerged in those hours, the stories that became myths, that became cosmologies, that eventually became religions and philosophies and scientific hypotheses, were not entertainment in the modern sense of something you choose to engage with and can equally choose to turn off. They were answers to questions that the darkness made unavoidable. What is out there beyond the fire? What happens when we die? Why does the moon grow and shrink and disappear and come back? What are the stars? Is there something watching from the dark? The history of human dreaming is inseparable from the history of the night, and it is stranger and more interesting than most people know. Dreams were not, for most of human history, understood as something the individual mind produced internally. They were understood as visitations, as communications from outside the dreamer, from the dead, from gods, from spirits, from the animals whose intelligence and power the dreamer's community depended on. The dream was a message received in the darkness, in the liminal state between waking and sleep, where the boundary between the ordinary world and the world beyond it was believed to be thinner than at other times. This understanding of dreams is not a primitive misunderstanding of neuroscience. It is a culturally coherent interpretation of a real and strange phenomenon that neuroscience is still not entirely able to explain. You lose consciousness. You enter a state in which your brain produces vivid sensory experiences that feel completely real while they are happening. You meet people who are dead. You visit places that do not exist. You experience events with an emotional intensity that daylight reality rarely matches. And then you wake up, and the experience is gone, retreating into a kind of half-memory that fades faster than almost any other type of memory you have. This is objectively strange. The fact that we call it dreaming and largely try not to think about it too carefully does not make it less strange. It makes it more remarkable that human beings have been having this experience every single stalk night for as long as our species has existed, and have been trying to make sense of it for just as long. The ancient world was saturated with dream interpretation. Every major ancient civilization had formal systems for understanding and interpreting dreams. The Mesopotamians compiled dream manuals, clay tablet collections that catalogued thousands of dream images and their meanings. The Egyptians built incubation temples where people could sleep in sacred spaces, specifically in hopes of receiving a healing or prophetic dream. The Greeks had similar temples, the most famous associated with Asclepius, the god of medicine, where the sick would sleep and hope for a dream that revealed the cure for their illness. The Romans took dreams seriously enough that generals sometimes made strategic decisions based on them, and the Senate occasionally received reports of dreams that were considered significant enough to warrant debate and action. The Hebrew Bible is full of prophetic dreams, from Jacob's ladder to Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams to Daniel's visions, and the interpretation of these dreams is understood in the text as a form of divine communication, so important that skilled dream interpreters were valued at the highest levels of royal courts. This was not superstition in the dismissive modern sense. This was rational response to lived experience, the attempt to make meaningful sense of something that genuinely happened every night, and that genuinely felt like contact with something larger than ordinary waking consciousness, and the night was the container in which that contact was made possible. The darkness, the fire dying down toward its coals, the gradual loosening of the grip of the waking mind as sleep approached. All of this was understood as preparation for receiving whatever the night had to offer in the form of dream. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most people find genuinely surprising when they first encounter it, because the way you sleep, the specific structure of your sleep on an ordinary night, is different from the way human beings slept for most of their history, and the difference is not small. It is a fundamental change in the architecture of rest that occurred only a few hundred years ago, and that may be responsible for a level of sleep-related distress that modern medicine tends to treat as a disorder when it might instead be an ancestral pattern trying to reassert itself. The historian Roger Ekirch spent 16 years researching nightlife in pre-industrial Europe and America, and what he found, buried in thousands of legal documents, diaries, medical texts, literature, and prayer books going back to ancient Greece, was evidence of a sleep pattern that he had never encountered described in any modern text on sleep science. People did not sleep in one long block. They slept in two separate periods, divided by an interval of waking that lasted roughly 1 to 2 hours in the middle of the night. This first sleep and second sleep, as they were consistently called in the historical sources, was not a sign of insomnia or poor health. It was the standard, expected, culturally normal structure of a night's rest. Ekirch eventually found more than 2,000 separate references to this pattern in a dozen languages, going back as far as Homer's Odyssey and the works of the Roman authors Livy, Virgil, and Plutarch. The pattern appears in medieval English, in Old French as premier somme, in Italian as primo sonno, and in references from South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. What did people do during the waking interval between their two sleeps? The historical sources are specific. They prayed, often using prayer books that were explicitly designed for the waking hours between first and second sleep. They had sex. They conversed with sleeping partners. They smoked, if tobacco was available. They drank ale or water. They lay in a state of quiet contemplation that Ekirch describes as particularly associated with vivid, accessible dreaming, because the hypnagogic state, at the boundary between waking and sleep, was understood to be especially rich in imagery and insight. Some got up and visited neighbors, a practice that strikes modern readers as strange, but that was completely normal in communities where everyone shared the same sleep schedule, and the time waking interval was a known and socially accepted part of the night. The disruption of this ancient pattern is traceable to a specific historical moment and a specific cause. The introduction of affordable artificial lighting, first through better candles and oil, lamps, and then through gas lighting, and finally electricity, extended the productive day into the hours that had previously belonged to darkness. The Industrial Revolution required workers to be available on a standardized schedule, to show up at a factory at a fixed time and work until another fixed time, without the biological flexibility of a two-phase sleep pattern. Night schools, night markets, and night entertainment became possible and then common as lighting made them safe and acceptable. The long, socially rich nighttime waking interval was gradually compressed and eventually eliminated as people began staying up later, starting their sleep later, and finding that the first sleep now lasted until morning. This transition happened within the last 300 or 400 years, which is almost nothing in evolutionary terms. The biology that governed human sleep for hundreds of thousands of years did not have time to adapt to the new schedule, and this may explain something that troubles enormous numbers of people in the modern world. The experience of waking in the middle of the night, lying in the dark for an hour or two, and being unable to return to sleep. This is classified in modern medicine as sleep maintenance, insomnia, and treated as a problem to be corrected, either through behavioral therapy or medication. But Ekirch and the sleep researchers, who have taken his historical research seriously, suggest another interpretation, that people who wake in the middle of the night may not be experiencing a malfunction. They may be experiencing the reassertion of an ancestral sleep pattern that is several thousand years old, a biological reminder that this was once the normal shape of a human night. The neuroscientist Russell Foster, a professor at Oxford who studies circadian rhythms, has described the waking interval between first and second sleep as a period associated with a specific neurological state, a kind of relaxed, hypnagogic consciousness that is particularly receptive to certain types of insight and creativity. The brain in this state is not the sharp, critical, analytical brain of full waking consciousness, but neither is it the deeply unconscious brain of slow-wave sleep. It is something in between, loose and associative, capable of making connections that the waking mind, with its commitments to logic and linear thinking, tends to filter out. This is the state that many of history's most famous thinkers have deliberately cultivated, either through the biphasic sleep pattern that Eckhart documented or through other practices designed to achieve a similar liminal consciousness. Thomas Edison famously napped in a chair holding ball bearings, so that when he drifted into sleep the bearings would fall and wake him, allowing him to capture the imagery from the hypnagogic state before it dissolved. Salvador Dali is said to have done the same thing with a key over a plate. The in-between state that modern medicine often treats as a sleep disorder was, for much of human history, understood as one of the most valuable hours of the night. The sleeping arrangements of our ancestors were not, in most cases, anything like what you are lying on right now. The idea of a private bedroom with a single bed occupied by one or two people is a remarkably daring invention, and one that was for most of history available only to the wealthy. For the vast majority of human existence, and for the vast majority of human beings, even in the historical period, sleep was a communal activity. Hunter-gatherer groups slept together around the fire. Medieval peasant families slept in a single room, often sharing a bed, not from necessity, but from warmth and the comfort of proximity. Travelers slept in inns in shared rooms, in beds they shared with strangers, and this was so normal that it required no comment. Samuel Pepys, the 17th-century English diarist, whose detailed account of his daily life is one of the most valuable social documents of the early modern period, records sleeping in beds with strangers in perfectly neutral terms, as if this required no more explanation than sharing a meal. The communal nature of sleep served functions beyond mere warmth. In the same way that the Jew Kamasi study showed that firelit nights generated the social, bonding and cultural transmission that daylight practicality crowded out, communal sleep served as a social buffer against the anxieties of the night. The sounds of other people breathing and moving, and occasionally speaking, reduced the particular loneliness of the dark hours in a way that the individual sleeper in a private bedroom cannot easily replicate. The historian Matthew Wolfe Meyer, who has written extensively on the history of sleep in America, traces a line from the introduction of private sleeping arrangements in the 19th century and the increasing medicalization of sleep problems in the 20th century, suggesting that the social isolation of the modern sleeping arrangement may itself be a contributing factor to the epidemic of sleep disorders that contemporary medicine tries to address with pills and therapeutic protocols. The Kungsan people, studied by the anthropologist Marjorie Shostak and others, slept in clusters around fires, waking and dozing in a pattern that researchers described as more like a series of rest periods than a single consolidated block of sleep. People would lie down, doze, wake, speak quietly, tend the fire, doze again, wake at a sound from the darkness, reassess the threat level, doze again. This pattern of light, easily interrupted sleep interspersed with periods of waking awareness, was not insomnia. It was adaptation. A group that slept in heavy, uninterrupted sleep through the African night would have been vulnerable to predators that a group with lighter, more responsive sleep could have detected and responded to. The consolidation of sleep into a single long uninterrupted block may be, at least in part, a product of the safety afforded by enclosed permanent shelter and artificial lighting, an adaptation to conditions of security that most of human history did not include. Jerome Siegel, a neuroscientist at UCLA, who has studied sleep in contemporary and hunter-gatherer communities in Tanzania, Namibia, and Bolivia, published findings in 2015 that complicated the picture somewhat. The communities he studied, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Trau Kungsan of Namibia, and the Chimane of Bolivia, did not show the clear biphasic sleep pattern that Eckertz documented in pre-industrial European sources. They slept an average of 6 to 7 hours per night, somewhat less than modern sleep guidelines recommend, and did not consistently show the midnight waking interval. Siegel's interpretation was that the biphasic pattern documented by Eckertz may have developed specifically in the longer nights of higher latitudes, where darkness lasted long, enough to interrupt sleep patterns in a way that shorter equatorial nights did not. In tropical East Africa, where human beings evolved, the nights are roughly 12 hours long year-round, which may have allowed a more consolidated sleep pattern than the much longer winter nights of Europe. What Siegel's communities did show, which directly contradicts a common modern assumption about ancient sleep, was that insomnia was essentially unknown among them. In the Hadza and the Wild Kungsan and the Tsimene, the concept of lying awake, unable to sleep, simply did not register as a trance, common experience, or a health problem. The communities went to sleep when the temperature dropped after sunset. They woke when the temperature rose near dawn, and in between, they slept. Not 8 hours, not in perfect pharmaceutical silence, with interruptions, with tending of fires, with the sounds of other community members, in temperatures that fluctuated across the night. But they slept without the particular torment of the modern insomniac, who lies in the dark and worries about not sleeping, whose anxiety about sleep compounds the wakefulness into a spiral that can persist for years. This suggests something important about the relationship between the conditions of sleep and the experience of sleep. The darkness, the temperature variation, the presence of other people, the fire, the sounds of the natural world. These were not obstacles to good sleep. They were the environment that human sleep evolved inside, and for which the biology of human sleep is still calibrated. The controlled, silent, temperature-regulated, light-sealed private bedroom may be, from the perspective of that ancient biology, a strange and alienating place, not the optimal sleeping environment, but a very recent substitute for one. The stars above those ancient sleepers deserve a moment of attention. Before artificial light, before the haze that modern electricity casts across the sky, the stars were not the faint and scattered points that most people see today. They were overwhelming. The Milky Way was not a faint smudge on the horizon, but a structural feature of the sky, as obvious as the horizon itself, a river of light so dense that it cast a measurable shadow on a clear, moonless night. Every culture that ever existed looked at this sky and found patterns in it, told stories about it, organized their understanding of time and season and direction around it. The stars were not decoration. They were the original calendar, the original compass, and the original evidence that the universe operated according to patterns, that the chaos of the natural world had an underlying order that patient observation could reveal. The hunter-gatherers who slept under that sky were not, by any reasonable definition, scientifically naive. The astronomical knowledge embedded in the oral traditions of indigenous cultures around the world is in many cases extraordinarily precise, tracking celestial events across timescales of hundreds of years through oral tradition alone, mapping the movements of stars and planets with an accuracy that Western astronomy did not achieve until the invention of precise instruments. The Aboriginal Australians, whose culture represents one of the oldest continuous traditions on Earth, have oral astronomical records going back thousands of years, including accounts of meteor impacts and other rare events that have been corroborated by geological evidence. They navigated by the stars, told the time of year by the position of the Pleiades, and built entire cosmological systems around the dark patches in the Milky Way, the spaces between the stars, as well as the stars themselves. The night sky was also the context in which the deepest questions about human existence were first seriously engaged. What are we? Where did we come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? These questions are not modern. They are at least as old as the capacity for language, which means they are at least as old as our species, and possibly older. They were asked by people lying on their backs in the dark, watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling the immensity of the sky above them and the smallness of the warm circle of firelight around them. And the answers they gave, which became myths and cosmologies, and eventually the world's great religious traditions, were not primitive confusions that science has superseded. They were first attempts to think seriously about the largest questions available to a conscious mind, offered in the only laboratory that existed, the open night sky above a campfire on the African savanna. The Milky Way in those ancient nights was not just a beautiful feature of the sky, it was a highway, a map, an address. The band of the galaxy visible from the southern hemisphere contains the center of the galaxy itself, the densest and brightest part of the Milky Way, and for cultures in southern Africa and Australia and South America, this core of the galaxy was understood as a place of enormous significance, a source, a destination, or a boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The dark patches in the Milky Way, the gaps where dust clouds absorb the starlight and create shapes against the bright background, were read by Aboriginal Australians as animals: the emu, the fish, the possum. These dark constellations, figures made of absence rather than presence, required the high dark sky of the southern hemisphere to see, a sky that artificial lighting has now made essentially unavailable to the majority of humanity. We have, in other words, lost the night, not completely, not irreversibly, but substantially, and in ways that we are only beginning to measure. The light pollution that has erased the Milky Way from the sky above most human settlements is not just an aesthetic loss, though it is certainly that. It is a biological disruption. Circadian rhythms, the internal clock that regulates the timing of sleep and wakefulness, hunger and metabolism, hormone production and immune function, evolved in an environment of reliable contrast between light and dark. The retinal cells that entrain the circadian clock to the day-night cycle are specifically sensitive to the blue wavelengths of light that are abundant in daylight and absent in firelight, the warm orange and red wavelengths of fire having very little effect on circadian timing. This means that for hundreds of thousands of years, the transition from daylight to firelight as the sun went down was a gentle, gradual signal to the circadian system that night was approaching, that it was time to begin the biological preparations for sleep. The transition from sunlight to electric light is a different matter entirely. Artificial lighting, especially the blue-rich light of LED screens and modern bulbs, sends the circadian system a signal that is more similar to daylight than to firelight, keeping the body in a state of biological day long after the actual day has ended. The consequences of this circadian disruption are still being mapped, but they are substantial. Research consistently links disrupted circadian rhythms to increased risk of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, depression, and certain cancers. Shift workers, whose schedules require them to be awake during the hours their biology is trying to prepare for sleep, show health outcomes consistently worse than those of people who sleep during the biological night. And the general population, which stays up hours later than its circadian biology would naturally prefer because of artificial lighting, phones and screens, is in a state of collective, low-grade circadian disruption that researchers sometimes call social jet lag. The difference between the time your body wants to sleep and the time that your social and work schedule actually permits. All of this because the night changed, not all at once, gradually, across a few hundred years, in a process so incremental that no single generation experienced it as a dramatic transformation. Candles came first, then better candles, then oil lamps, then gas lamps, then electric light, then the small, brilliant, always present screen that most people now carry with them into the bedroom that was always supposed to be their refuge from the artificial day. Each step was a reasonable response to a local problem. Candles made winter evenings less dangerous, gas lamps made city streets safer, electric light made factories more productive, screens made information and connection available at any moment. No one decided to eliminate the biological night. It was eliminated incrementally as a side effect of 1,000 separate decisions to make the darkness less dark, each one individually sensible and collectively transformative in ways that we are still working out. There is a thought experiment worth sitting with as you rest here. Imagine that you could be transported back, not to a different country or a different time in history, but simply to the same place where you are right now, at the same time of year, at the same hour of night. But the electricity is gone. The city lights are gone. Every artificial light source has been removed. What you would experience first is the darkness, a depth of dark that most people alive today have never actually stood in. Then you would experience the silence, because the mechanical hum of electrical infrastructure that most people in cities have so thoroughly habituated to that they no longer consciously hear it would be gone. And then, as your eyes adjusted, you would experience the sky, the same sky that is above you right now, above the light pollution that currently hides most of it, a sky so dense with stars that it would feel almost like a presence, like a ceiling that was lit from the inside rather than a void that occasionally had points of light in it. That sky was the last thing your ancestors looked at before they closed their eyes to sleep. It was the first thing they looked at when they woke during the interval between their first and second sleep, rising from their beds or their sleeping places to step outside and check the fire, and look up at the stars and know where they were in the night by the position of the moon and turning of the constellations. The sky was a clock and a compass and a story and a prayer all at once, and it was available every clear night, free, to everyone, requiring nothing but the willingness to look up. We have traded that sky for something else, for the convenience and safety and productivity that artificial light makes possible, and the trade has been mostly worth it. It would be difficult to argue otherwise. But something was lost, not just the aesthetic beauty of a dark sky, though that is genuinely lost. Something in the rhythm of the body, the calibration of the internal clock to the real cycle of light and dark, the social richness of the firelit night, the particular texture of consciousness that the interval between first and second sleep made available to those who lived inside it. These things have not been entirely replaced by what we gained, and some of the distress that modern people carry about sleep, the anxiety, the insomnia, the sense of lying awake in the dark with nothing but their thoughts, may be at least partly a consequence of the mismatch between the ancient biology of sleep and the modern conditions in now, which sleep is expected to occur. The fire is still there, in a sense. Not the literal fire, though you can still build one and watch what it does to a group of people gathered around it in the dark, how the conversation changes and slows and deepens, how the claims become something close to a shared object of attention that lowers the threshold for the kind of intimate, story-shaped talk that the Juho Hunsi firelit recordings captured. The fire is in the candle on a dinner table that makes conversation feel different from its conversation in overhead fluorescent light. It is in the screen's glow in a dark room that, for all its blue light problems, serves some of the same social functions as the campfire, a shared point of light in the dark, a container for story, a reason to gather. The human need for a fire in the dark has not gone away. It has just found new forms, some of them better than others, some of them more faithful to the ancient pattern than they might appear. The dark itself has not gone away either. It comes back every time there is a power failure, Every time you step away from the city, into countryside, dark enough to let the stars show, it comes back in the moment, just before sleep, in the particular quality of darkness behind your closed eyes. It comes back in the middle of the night, when the sleep pattern that your ancestors knew so well reasserts itself, and you lie awake, not broken, not disordered, but perhaps closer to the original human experience of night than you are at any other time, closer to the fire and the stars and the particular quiet of the small hours, and the knowledge, felt rather than thought, that the darkness is not empty, that something lives in it, that something has always lived in it, that you are not, in the dark, alone. Let that thought settle now, not as something frightening, but as something old and familiar and true. The darkness around you is the same darkness your ancestors lay in, 200,000 years ago and more, on the other side of the world, around a fire that is now cold and gone. They looked up at the same stars that are above you now, wheeling in the same slow arc they have been turning through for the entire span of human existence. They felt the same loosening of the day's grip. They felt their thoughts softening at the edges, losing their urgency, becoming images rather than problems. They felt the approach of sleep the same way you feel it now, as a tide that rises from somewhere deep in the body and eventually becomes impossible to resist. They let it take them, as you can let it take you now, into the dark behind the eyes, where the dreams are forming, where the night does its ancient work of repair and restoration and the strange, necessary business of dreaming. They slept, they woke in the quiet middle hours and looked at the stars and lay down again. They slept a second time, deeply, into the pre-dawn dark, and in the morning they rose and went about the business of being alive, as you will, as everyone who has ever fallen asleep under this sky has always done. Sleep now. The fire is tended. The night is old. You are safe inside it. Let it hold you, as it has held every human being who has ever lived, all the way down into the deep and quiet dark where rest lives, and nothing is required of you but this. Sleep now. The night has been here forever. It knows what to do with you. The sounds of the ancient night are worth dwelling on, because they are so different from what fills the dark hours today that imagining them properly requires a kind of deliberate effort. The modern night has a sound signature that most people have so thoroughly habituated to that they no longer consciously register it. The low, electrical hum of transformers and refrigerators and HVAC systems, the distant white noise of traffic on roads that are never entirely empty, the occasional siren, the aircraft overhead, the neighbor's television through a shared wall. These sounds are so consistent, so ever-present, that the brain has categorized them as background and largely removed them from conscious attention. They are there, but they are invisible in the way that familiar smells become invisible, and their absence, in a genuine power outage in a city suddenly gone dark, is one of the most disorienting aspects of the experience. The ancient night was full of sound, but a completely different inventory of sounds. Insects, in most of the environments where human beings evolved, are among the loudest and most persistent sources of nighttime sound, and their chorus in warm weather would have been overwhelming by modern standards. A wall of sound that varied in pitch and rhythm through the night in response to temperature and humidity and the passage of time. The African night in particular, the environment in which human biology was shaped, is not quiet. Frogs, nightjars, owls, the distant calls of larger animals, the wind in different kinds of vegetation, each of these has a signature that a skilled listener could read for information the way we read text. A sudden silence in the insect chorus, a cessation of frog song in a particular direction, the change in the wind that brings a new smell. All of these were signals that the experienced, nighttime listener could interpret to understand what was happening in the darkness beyond the fire's reach. This listening was a skill, not an innate ability, but a learned competence that was transmitted across generations, built through accumulated experience of what sounds preceded what events, what silences meant what movements. The tracker who could read the nighttime soundscape was as valuable to a hunter-gatherer community as the navigator who could read the stars. Both were translating the available information into survival-relevant knowledge about the state of the world. Both were exercising forms of intelligence that the modern world has largely made unnecessary, and that have consequently atrophied in ways that are difficult to measure, but that many people who spend time in genuinely wild places report noticing. The soundscape of the natural night, when you first immerse yourself in it after a life spent in cities, is initially overwhelming, then gradually becomes readable in a way that feels less like learning a new skill and more like recovering an old one, as if the capacity for it was always there, waiting to be engaged, and the modern environment had simply provided no occasion for it. The cold of the ancient night deserves attention too, because it was not a problem that could be solved by adjusting a thermostat. In many of the environments where early humans lived, nighttime temperatures dropped substantially from daytime highs, and the management of that temperature drop was one of the central practical challenges of the dark hours. Fire was the primary solution, but fire required fuel and attention, and a fire that died in the tension left the community exposed not just to cold, but to the predators that the fire had been keeping at a distance. The tending of the fire was therefore a nighttime social responsibility, distributed across the community in a way that the individual sleeper in a sealed private bedroom does not have to think about. Someone stayed awake or slept lightly enough to respond to the fire's needs. This role, the fire tender, the night watcher, had a social significance in hunter-gatherer communities that extended beyond the purely practical. The person who watched through the darkest hours while others slept was exercising a form of trust and care for the group that was recognized and valued, the ancient precursor of the night nurse, the night watchman, the parent lying awake, listening for a child's breathing in the dark. Body heat was the other solution to the cold, and communal sleeping was not just socially comfortable, but thermally necessary in the coldest conditions. Archaeological evidence from Neanderthal sleeping sites suggests that these close relatives of modern humans slept in tight groups in sheltered locations, sharing body warmth in a way that individual sleeping would not have made possible. The design of the human body, particularly the ways in which heat is lost and retained during sleep, is calibrated for a sleeping environment that is somewhat cooler than a comfortable waking temperature, and for sleeping in proximity to other bodies that contribute to the thermal environment. The isolated individual in a temperature-controlled bedroom at a standardized optimal sleeping temperature is sleeping in conditions that are comfortable by modern standards, but that differ significantly from the thermal environment that shaped the biology of human sleep. The relationship between darkness and the perineal gland is one of the most direct links between the ancient night and the biochemistry of your body right now. The perineal gland, a small structure deep in the brain that Descartes famously called the seat of the soul, produces melatonin in response to darkness, not in response to the passage of time, not in response to fatigue, but specifically in response to the absence of light, particularly the absence of blue spectrum light that signals the presence of the sun. As the day darkens into evening, the pineal gland begins releasing melatonin into the bloodstream, and this melatonin is one of the primary signals that tells every cell in your body that night is coming, and biological preparations for rest should begin. Body temperature begins to fall, alertness decreases, the metabolism slows, the immune system shifts into repair mode. The brain begins the consolidation of the day's memories, sorting and filing and discarding, building the long-term storage of what will become your permanent memory of today. This process evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in response to a very specific light, Environment: bright, blue-rich daylight, transitioning through the warm golden light of sunset into the orange and red wavelengths of fire, and eventually into complete darkness. The melatonin system is exquisitely sensitive to this transition. It responds strongly to the difference between the light of the sun and the light of fire, the former inhibiting melatonin production and the latter allowing it, which means that for most of human history, the transition from working daylight to resting firelight was also a transition from melatonin suppression to melatonin production. The body used the quality of light itself as a clock, and the clock ran accurately because the circle reliably changed in the way that evolution had calibrated it to expect. Then the light stopped changing reliably. The broad-spectrum artificial light of the modern evening, and above all the blue-rich light of screens, maintains the kind of light environment that the melatonin system reads as daytime, suppressing melatonin production for hours after the social environment of the modern world considers the day to have ended. The body's clock says it is still afternoon, while the calendar says it is 11 at night, and the person attached to these competing timekeeping systems is trying to decide whether to go to sleep. The conflict between the social clock and the biological clock is not a minor inconvenience. It is a fundamental source of the sleep disruption that modern medicine has been trying to address for decades, largely by treating the symptoms rather than the cause. The ancient solution was simpler and more elegant. Go to bed when it gets dark. Not a rigid bedtime imposed from outside, but the biological system doing what it was designed to do, responding to the actual light environment of the actual day and translating that information directly into the physiological preparation for sleep. Hunter-gatherer communities, studied by modern sleep researchers, typically fall asleep within a few hours of sunset and rise near dawn or shortly after, their sleep timing driven directly by light and temperature rather than by clocks or schedules. They get, on average, somewhat less sleep than modern guidelines recommend, but the sleep they get is more deeply consolidated with their biological rhythms, and the insomnia and sleep anxiety that plague modern populations are essentially absent from them. This is the most important thing to understand about the ancient night and its relationship to how you sleep now. The darkness was not the enemy of sleep, it was the precondition for sleep. The night that frightened your ancestors, the absolute darkness full of sounds and movements, and the permanent possibility of predators, was also the environment that their biology was perfectly tuned to rest inside. The fear and the rest were not contradictory. They were part of the same system, the fear keeping alertness available in case it was needed, the fire and the community and the gradual accumulation of hours managing the fear down to a level that sleep could emerge beneath, and the darkness itself providing the precise light signal that the melatonin system needed to do its work properly. You are, right now, in the most ancient part of that process. The world around you has gone quiet. The demands of the day have subsided. Your body is doing what bodies have been doing in the dark for 200,000 years, releasing the chemistry of rest, lowering the temperature at the body's core, preparing the immune system for its nightly rounds, beginning the slow construction of the night's dreams. The darkness behind your eyes is not empty. It is full of the accumulated experience of every night your ancestors survived, every fire they tended, every story they told in the firelit hours before sleep claimed them, every dawn they woke to see. You carry all of that in the biology of how you rest, in the way your melatonin rises with the dark, in the way your body temperature falls as sleep approaches, in the way the middle of the night sometimes finds you awake and contemplative, in a way that has its own particular quality, neither the sharp alertness of morning, nor the muddy heaviness of deep sleep, but something ancient and quiet, and its own. The fire has been burning for 400,000 years, not the same fire, but fire, continuous, passed from one community to the next, kept alive through the ice ages, and the migrations and the building of cities, and the invention of electricity, and the making of the screen whose light you may have been looking at, before you put it down and let the dark back in. The fire is still here. Its warmth is in the blanket that covers you. Its light is in the candle memory of every story that has ever been told in the dark, to push the fear back and make the night bearable. Its function is in the community of everyone who has ever slept near another sleeping person and been comforted by the sound of their breathing. You are sleeping inside a tradition that is older than language, older than farming, older than the first deliberate art made on the wall of a cave. You are sleeping the way your species has always slept, in the dark, in the company of whatever you have gathered around you against the night, waiting for the dawn that has always come. Let the night do its work now. Let the darkness behind your eyes deepen into something you stop tracking. Let the sounds around you become the background against which something quieter and more essential can emerge. The slow pulse of the body at rest, the breath finding its own rhythm without your direction, the long, unhurried process of sleep taking you somewhere that waking cannot follow. The night is old. It knows what to do. It has been doing this since long before you arrived in it, and it will keep doing it long after. The particular shape of your experience of it has faded into the larger story of what it means to be human in the dark. Sleep now, deeply. Well, the way they always have, the way you always have, the way, tonight, you will again. The moon deserves its own chapter in the story of the ancient night, because it was the most powerful and most changeable feature of the nighttime sky, and because its effect on human experience, over hundreds of thousands of years, has left marks that are still visible in language and culture and biology today. The word month comes from the same root as moon, because the roughly 29.5-day cycle of the lunar phases was the most reliable natural calendar available to human beings before written records. The word menstruation shares the same etymology, the monthly cycle of the human body that runs on a period so close to the lunar cycle that the connection has been observed, speculated upon, and debated across cultures and centuries. The word lunatic, yuta, preserves the ancient belief that the full moon affected human mental states in ways that were unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The full moon was the exception in the ancient night, the interruption of the absolute darkness that otherwise ruled the hours between sunset and dawn. On the nights around the full moon, the world outside the fire's circle was not entirely dark. The landscape was visible, at least in silhouette, at least well enough to move through. The paths between camps and water sources could be navigated. The shape of a large animal against the sky could be distinguished. The full moon gave back, for a few nights each month, something of the visual competence that darkness routinely removed. And this changed behavior. Hunter-gatherer communities in contemporary studies show different activity patterns around the full moon than at other times, with more nighttime movement, more social activity, sometimes more nocturnal hunting. The Tanzanian lion study cited earlier found that lion attacks on humans increased dramatically in the period of maximum darkness, the days just after the full moon, when the waning crescent rose late and left the evening hours completely unlit, exactly as the lion's biological opportunity was greatest. The full moon was also, in virtually every human culture that has ever been studied, a time of special significance. Festivals, rituals, communal ceremonies, across cultures from the Arctic to the equator, from ancient Mesopotamia to contemporary indigenous communities in Australia and South America and North America, the full moon marks a moment when the community gathers, when the ordinary rules of daily life are briefly suspended, when contact with the sacred, or the ancestral, or the cosmological, is sought with particular intensity. The universality of this pattern is striking enough to suggest that it reflects something real about the effect of the full moon on human social behavior, something beyond cultural convention or religious tradition, something closer to the biological response of a species whose nighttime experience was transformed, month by the cycling of the moon's light across the dark. The moon's light is, of course, reflected sunlight, and its color is therefore similar to the blue-rich spectrum of daylight, which means it has a similar effect on the melatonin system as artificial light. Studies of sleep in populations without access to artificial lighting have found that sleep patterns do in fact shift across the lunar cycle, with people going to sleep later and sleeping less around the full moon than at the dark of the moon. The body responds to moonlight as a signal, not as strong as sunlight and not as strong as artificial light, but real enough to alter the timing of sleep in a detectable way. The ancient experience of the full moon as a special time, a time when sleep came differently and the night felt different, was not superstition, it was biology. The Milky Way, as mentioned earlier, served as a calendar as well as a compass and a cosmology. Different stars rise and set at different times of year, and the position of bright stars at specific times of night tells a skilled observer not just where they are, but when they are in the cycle of the year. The Pleiades, the small cluster of stars, also known as the Seven Sisters, were used by cultures across the world as a marker of seasonal transitions. Their heliacal rising, the moment in the year when they first become visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn, marked the beginning of the planting season in many agricultural cultures and the beginning of specific ceremonial periods in hunter-gatherer ones. The ability to read these signals was not mystical. It was practical knowledge, accumulated over generations of careful observation, preserved in oral tradition across centuries, and constituting one of the most impressive intellectual achievements of pre-literate human culture. The people who developed and maintained this knowledge were sleeping outside, under the sky, every night of their lives. Not occasionally, as a romantic escape from indoor modernity, but as the default condition of existence. They knew the sky the way urban people know their neighborhoods, with an intimacy born of constant exposure and the practical necessity of navigating by what they could observe. The astronomer who spends a career studying the behavior of a particular class of stars through a telescope has a certain kind of knowledge. The hunter-gatherer who watched the entire visible sky every night of their life, from childhood to old age, who knew what the weather would do by the color of the sunset and the stars, sind who, vish, mamasdri selt, who navigated by the stars and timed their focus to migrations by them, and told their children the stories embedded in them, had a different kind of knowledge, not inferior, not less rigorous, just differently organized, differently transmitted, and differently embedded in the practical life of the people who held it. We have inherited almost none of this knowledge in usable form. The constellations that most people in the modern world can name, the Big Dipper, and Orion, and perhaps the Southern Cross, are the tourist version of a navigational system of extraordinary precision and depth. The stories embedded in those constellations, in most modern tellings, are stripped of the seasonal and directional information they originally encoded, reduced to myths in the literary sense, rather than preserved in the functional sense. The Aboriginal Australian astronomical traditions, which are among the most intact and best studied of the world's indigenous sky knowledge systems, show what a fully realized human relationship with the night sky looks like when it has been maintained across tens of thousands of years without interruption. The detailed knowledge of when and where specific stars rise and set, the seasonal and directional information encoded in the shapes of the dark constellations, the ceremonial calendar built around celestial events. This is a complete system of knowledge, complete in the sense of being genuinely adequate to the practical and spiritual needs of the people who maintain it, and it was built and preserved by Toga who slept outside and watched the sky every night of their lives. The dreams of those ancient sky watchers would have been different from ours, not in the basic neurological mechanism, which is the same in all human brains, but in the imagery available to the dreaming mind. Your dreams draw on the material of your waking experience, the faces and places and situations that your daily life provides. The dreams of a hunter-gatherer in the African savanna 50,000 years ago would have drawn on a completely different inventory. The specific trees and grasses and water sources of their territory, the animals they tracked and feared and ate, the faces of the 50 or so people who constituted their entire social world, the specific movements of the stars and planets and moon that they observed every clear night. A brain immersed in the natural world would have dreamed a natural world, populated by animals and plants and weather and stars, in a way that urban human dreams, populated by cars and phones and hallways and crowded public spaces, are not. This matters because the content of dreams was not, for most of human history, considered irrelevant or merely personal. Dreams were messages, and the quality and content of those messages depended on the quality and range of the dreamer's waking experience. The shaman who sought visions for the community needed to have immersed themselves in the full richness of the natural world, to have developed the depth of relationship with animals and plants and landscapes that would allow the dreaming mind to receive meaningful communication from those sources. The vision quest traditions of indigenous North American cultures, which typically involved days of solitary fasting and exposure in a natural landscape, were designed in part to accomplish exactly this, to saturate the dreamer's sensory experience with the natural world so completely that the dreaming mind would have the necessary material to work with. We have not lost the capacity for this kind of dreaming. The brain that generates your dreams tonight is the same brain, operating by the same mechanisms that generated visions for the shamans and dreamers of the ancient world. What has changed is the input. The dreams draw on the available material, and the available material has changed. This is neither a tragedy nor an improvement. It is simply the current situation, the latest chapter in the ongoing story of how human experience shapes the content of the dreaming mind. The night is still the container for that dreaming. The darkness is still the condition in which it occurs. And the ancient biology that makes sleep and dreaming possible is still running, every night, in every human brain on Earth, regardless of what century it finds itself in, or what the sky above looks like, or whether the fire is burning, or the melatonin is rising, in response to genuine darkness, or is being suppressed by a screen. You are, right now, at the threshold of that ancient process, not looking up at the Milky Way, not listening for lions, not tending a fire or keeping watch for the community's safety through the dark hours, but underneath all the modern arrangements that separate you from that original experience, the same biology is running, the same melatonin is rising, the same core temperature is falling, the same immune system is shifting into repair mode, the same brain is preparing to do what it has done every night for as long as there have been human brains to do it, to release the grip of waking consciousness, to let the accumulated experience of the day dissolve into the processing and sorting and consolidation of sleep, and eventually to generate the dreams that are, in some sense, the mind's attempt to find meaning in what has happened, to connect the particular events of this specific day to the larger patterns of a life and a species and a world. The story of the ancient night is, in the end, your story. Not metaphorically, literally. The darkness you are descending into right now is the same darkness that has been holding human beings every night for 200,000 years. The sleep that is approaching is the same sleep, running on the same biological machinery, serving the same essential functions. The dreams that will come, whenever they come, will be generated by the same dreaming brain that generated the visions and the stories that the ancient firelit communities told to make the night bearable and meaningful. None of this has changed. The world around it has changed almost beyond recognition, but the night, and what the body does with the night remains stubbornly, beautifully ancient. There is something comforting in that. If you let yourself feel it, you are not alone in this darkness. You are in the company of every human being who has ever lain down and felt the day release its hold on them. Every mother who has listened for her baby's breathing in the night. Every traveler who has looked up at unfamiliar stars from an unfamiliar place and felt the size of the world. Every child who has been afraid of the dark and then, gradually, been taught by experience that the dark is survivable, that the things that move in it are mostly harmless, that the fire or the nightlight or the presence of another person is enough to make the darkness a place of rest rather than of threat. Every hunter who has sat by a dying fire in the long hours before dawn and felt the particular quality of thought that the middle of the night makes possible, looser than daylight thinking, less directed, more willing to follow an association wherever it leads. All of them, everyone who has ever been human and been afraid and been safe and been tired and closed their toothed eyes against the dark and trusted the night to give them back to the morning. That is the community you belong to, right now, in this moment before sleep takes you. The largest community in the world, the oldest, the one that has no borders and no language requirement and no membership beyond the simple fact of being human and needing, as all humans have always needed, to rest. The fire is low. The stars are turning. The night is doing what the night has always done. Let it take you where it knows how to take you, into the deep and necessary dark where the body repairs itself and the mind makes its strange nightly journey through the material of a life. Sleep well. The night will hold you. It always has. It always will. Sleep now. The seasonal variation in the ancient night is something that people who live in climate-controlled buildings with consistent artificial lighting have almost entirely lost awareness of. The night in winter, in the higher latitudes where many of our ancestors eventually migrated, was not the same length as the night in summer. In Scotland, or Scandinavia, or northern Russia, the winter night could last 16 or 17 hours, a darkness so long that it consumed the majority of the 24-hour cycle, leaving only a narrow window of grey winter daylight for the practical work of the day. The summer night in those same latitudes could shrink to 6 or 7 hours, barely enough for a full cycle of sleep. The biological rhythms of sleep and wakefulness were not fighting this variation. They were calibrated to it, expanding and contracting with the season in a pattern that researchers who study circadian biology call entrainment, the synchronization of internal biological clocks to external environmental signals. The seasonal variation in sleep timing and duration has been largely eliminated by artificial lighting and climate control. Modern people in northern latitudes do not sleep significantly more in winter than in summer, because the light environment that would signal the longer winter night to the circadian system has been replaced by a consistent artificial light environment that produces essentially the same melatonin signal regardless of season. But the biology has not forgotten. Seasonal affective disorder, the depression and fatigue and increased sleep need that some people experience in winter months is at least partly a consequence of the mismatch between the body's evolved expectation of more darkness, more sleep, and more seasonal variation and the modern, light environment that provides none of those things. The body expects winter to feel different from summer, not just in temperature, but in the quality and duration of the dark. And when that expected variation is removed, something in the system registers the absence as a deprivation. The ancient solution to the long winter night was not, as might be imagined, one of misery and deprivation. The historical and anthropological record suggests that the long dark season in northern communities was understood as a time of a different kind of productivity, not the outdoor, physical, daylight productivity of the warm months, but the indoor, social, storytelling, craft-making, memory-transmitting productivity of the fireside. The Norse concept of hygge, which the modern world has recently rediscovered and fetishized as a Danish lifestyle philosophy, is at its core a description of the traditional use of the long northern winter night, the warm firelit gathering against the cold dark outside, the food and the drink and the stories, and the particular quality of social closeness that long nights in small spaces with trusted people can produce. This was not a marketing concept or a lifestyle trend. It was the adaptation of a culture to the reality of 6 months of very long, very cold, very dark nights, and it produced a richness of inner and social life that the endless, undifferentiated, artificially extended day of modernity has in some ways made harder to access. The cave paintings of the European Upper Paleolithic, made between roughly 40,000 and 12,000 years ago, are among the most direct evidence we have of what ancient human beings were thinking about in the dark. The caves where these paintings are found were not, for the most part, living spaces. They were deep, dark, often difficult to access, places that required artificial light to navigate. The paintings were made in firelight by people who went deep into the earth, carrying fat-burning lamps or torches, into a darkness that was even more complete than the darkness of the surface night, a darkness that blocked out every trace of the sky and the stars and the world above, and left only the stone walls of the cave and the small mobile circle of lamplight by which the artist worked. In that profound darkness, they painted horses, bison, mammoths, aurochs, deer, and human figures in extraordinary detail, with a skill and a vision that requires genuine talent to produce even with modern materials and understanding of proportion and perspective. They used the curves and textures of the cave wall to give their animals a three-dimensional quality that makes them seem to move in the flickering lamplight. They pressed their hands against the stone and blew pigment around them, leaving handprints that are among the most immediately human and most immediately moving images in all of art, because they are so simple and so direct. I was here. I pressed my hand to the stone. I left a mark in the dark. What these paintings were for is still debated. They were not, in most cases, placed where they could be easily seen by large groups of people. Many of the most spectacular images are in narrow passages and deep chambers that are difficult to reach and can accommodate only a few people at a time. They were not, as was once thought, simple hunting magic, because many of the animals depicted do not appear to be prey species, and many of the images show animals in contexts that have no clear, hunting-related narrative. The most widely accepted current interpretation is that the caves were ritual spaces, places where the transition from the surface world to the underground world was understood as a transition between the ordinary world and the world of spirits or ancestors, and where the act of making images in the dark, surrounded by the sounds of the earth and the absolute darkness beyond the lamplight, was a form of communication with whatever inhabited that deeper realm. What we know with certainty is that people went into those caves in the dark, carrying their small lights, and spent time there, making things of extraordinary beauty and complexity in conditions of profound sensory isolation. The darkness of a deep cave is not the darkness of a night outside. It is a complete and permanent darkness, the darkness of a place where no light has ever reached by natural means. The silence of a deep cave is different from the silence of the surface night, which is never actually silent. A deep cave is a genuinely soundless space, where the only sound is whatever you bring into it, and the sounds your own body makes. People who have spent time in these spaces report that they produce a particular quality of heightened awareness, a state of intensified attention to the remaining senses and to the remaining experience of consciousness, that is different from what the surface world produces. This may be part of what was being sought in the deep cave rituals of the Upper Paleolithic, not merely a physical space, but a sensory condition, a kind of enforced darkness and silence that produced the liminal, boundary-crossing consciousness that sacred practices around the world have sought through various means. The darkness of the cave and the darkness of sleep have more in common than is immediately obvious. Both involve the withdrawal of ordinary sensory input, both involve a shift in the quality of consciousness away from the sharp, outward-directed awareness of the functioning daylight mind and toward something more inward, more imagistic, more receptive to whatever arises from the depths of the mind's own activity. The cave painter, working by lamplight in the deep dark of the earth, and the dreamer descending, through the hypnagogic state, into the imagery of sleep, are both, in some sense, going to the same place, the interior space, where the ordinary rules of the waking, daylit, surface world do not fully apply, and where the mind can encounter what it is carrying in its depths. This parallel was not lost on the ancient world. Dream incubation rituals in ancient Greece and Egypt and Mesopotamia often involved spending the night in a sacred space, a temple or cave, or specially designated sleeping area, in Tenka's conditions of darkness and ritual preparation, designed to facilitate the kind of dream that was sought. The darkness was not incidental to these rituals. It was constitutive of them. The darkness was the condition for the encounter, the medium through which the communication between the ordinary world and the sacred world was made possible. And the morning, when the dreamer emerged from the dark space into the daylight and reported what they had received, was the moment when the sacred knowledge became available to the community, when the interior journey of the night was translated back into the practical language of the day. You are lying at the boundary between those two worlds right now, not in a sacred cave, not at a healing temple, but at the same boundary that those ancient dreamers crossed every night, the edge of ordinary waking consciousness where the light of active thought dims and the darker country of sleep becomes available. The night does not require ceremony to do its work. It requires only this, that you stop holding the day in place, stop gripping the waking state with the effort that keeping it requires, and let the boundary dissolve. The body knows what to do at this point. It has been doing it every night for the entire span of human existence. You do not have to guide it, or instruct it, or manage it. You only have to stop preventing it. The fire that your ancestors sat around, in all those thousands of years of nights before electricity, was many things at once. It was warmth and protection, and the thing that made the night survivable. It was the stage on which human culture performed its most important acts of transmission, the stories and the songs and the rituals that carried the accumulated wisdom of the community across generations. It was the circle that defined the boundary between the known and the unknown, the safe and the dangerous, the us and the everything else that the darkness contained. And it was the thing that made sleep possible, by holding the darkness at a manageable distance, while the human bodies, gathered around it, accomplished the nightly work of repair and consolidation and dreaming. The fire has taken many forms since then. It is the night light in the hallway, and the porch light left on for someone coming home late, and the street light visible through the curtain, and the standby light on the television, and the glow of the phone, face down on the nightstand. These are all fires in the oldest sense, points of light in the dark that say someone is here, the night is being managed, you are not entirely alone in the darkness. They are not as good as the original fire. They do not provide warmth or the particular quality of light that allows the melatonin system to function as it should, or the social richness of a community gathered around a shared flame. But they are continuous with it, the latest instances of the oldest human technology, the use of light to make the dark less dark, and the night less completely the territory of whatever moved, and hunted, and waited in it. The morning is coming, It is always coming. The darkest part of the night is already behind you now, even if you cannot feel it. Even if the darkness around you seems as complete as it has been all night. The earth is turning toward the sun, as it has been doing for 4.5 billion years, as it was doing before there were human beings to experience the result of its turning, as it will be doing long after the particular configuration of matter and energy that constitutes you has been resolved back into its component parts and rejoined the larger story of the universe. The sun is below the horizon, already beginning to lighten the sky in the direction that faces east, already warming the air that will eventually replace the cold air of the night. The birds that will announce the dawn are still sleeping, but they will wake soon, and, when they care, the sound will be the same sound that announced the dawn for every sleeping creature that has ever existed on this planet. The world restarting, the day beginning, the long, reliable rotation of the earth continuing on its path. You do not need to know any of that right now. You only need to be here, in this body, in this darkness, at this moment, that is the last moment, before the next moment takes you somewhere you will not consciously witness. The place where sleep lives is just ahead, a little further down than where you are now, a little darker and a little quieter, and a little further from the surface of the day. You know the way. You have always known the way. Go there now. Go there the way your ancestors went there, every night, in the firelight and the darkness and the sound of the night insects and the wheel of the stars overhead and the breathing of the people, sleeping near them. Go there as everyone who has ever been human has always gone, trusting the darkness, trusting the night, trusting the body's ancient knowledge of what to do when the day is done, and the fire burns low, and the stars turn slowly overhead, and there is nothing left required of you. But this, sleep. The night will keep you. The morning is coming. Sleep now.